New Oxfam research claims that the richest 1% of New Zealanders banked almost a third of all the wealth created last year. The report out later today also reaffirms the finding from the same research last year that 2 New Zealand men own more wealth than the poorest 30% of our adult population. Oxfam New Zealand's Executive Director Rachel Mesurier joins me now in the studio. Kia ora, good morning and welcome to you.
Kia ora.
Thanks for coming in this morning. What do you see as the primary finding from this research?
Well, the primary finding for Oxfam around the world is that this gap is getting bigger between the extremely rich and basically the rest of us. But the particular focus for us here in New Zealand is that 30%, the poorest portion of our society, really gained no extra benefit from that new wealth from last year.
All right, we'll return to that, but let's unpick that major thrust of your argument that, and we hear it a lot, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, but when we look at actually income, and this is from Brian Perry, who does the research for MESD, and you look at his latest report, I went back this morning and looked at it from July 2017, the latest numbers we've got. He says that the share received by the top 1% increased from 5% in the mid-80s to about 9% in the mid-1990s, so it almost doubled. Big increase in wealth for the top 1% in the mid-80s to 1990s. It was steady or falling through to 2014, so it's 7 to 9% now. And he says that there is no evidence of any rise over the last 20 years, basically.
And I think if I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that about the income
That's
versus income? So that is actually a very key difference. And many New Zealanders, particularly Aucklanders, are very aware of how much wealth has absolutely exponentially grown.
Okay, so let's just be clear for listeners about this then.
This is about wealth.
So income, in terms of the top income earners, the top 1% in New Zealand, this report says that we're low to middle in the OECD. So for that, top 1% does not have a big share of the income in terms of income earners. What you're talking about, and you accept that?
Absolutely, this is wealth.
Okay, this is wealth.
This is wealth, and it is global wealth. It's come from the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Data Book, and it's done by Oxfam everywhere, looking at what the wealth change is. So we know that that's a combination of what you've done with your income. Some of it will be discretionary, some of it ends up in the bank. It's about our assets. Particularly in the OECD, what we've seen over the last decade or two is the growth in property value.
In New Zealand, what's driving that is property prices? One
of the reasons is property prices. There are others, but that's a significant chunk, and we're very conscious of that here in Auckland. But that's been replicated, particularly in OECD countries around the world.
So should people be concerned about this? I mean, if someone's property price has gone up and they have a net wealth that's higher than someone else, then how does that materially represent itself as a problem for people?
And what we're talking about here for Oxfam is the extremely wealthy. So we're really looking at the top 1% globally, and we're very, very conscious that in New Zealand we've only got those 2 billionaires. We're not big players on that global page, but in New Zealand, what that still plays out with our small population is that the gap between that incredibly rich and basically the rest of us is unacceptable.
It's interesting, but if you took Graham Hart out tomorrow and you took out Richard Chandler, is it the other one?
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. How would that make anyone else better off? I mean, it's interesting and it might worry some people when you look at it on first flush, but how does it actually materially affect people? If I took out Graham Hart tomorrow, well, not took him out, but actually redistributed his wealth before I get the letter from the lawyers, how does that help us?
Well, I think what Oxfam is really looking at is why is this gap as big as it is? And the most important thing for us is what's the impact of this gap, both globally and in New Zealand.
What is the impact in New Zealand
and what we
from Graham Hart having a lot of money?
Well, it's about the fact that the rest of New Zealand, particularly that lowest 30%, they only got 1% of that growth last year. Is that acceptable for us in New Zealand?
Well,
this is 1.4 million people.
Well, let's dig into that number though too, because what you're counting is people who have got assets versus people who haven't got assets in terms of net wealth, right? That means that anyone who is in debt counts as worse off than someone who even had $200 to their name. my argument hasn't been very well expressed, but basically if I was a medical student who was 30 years old and had a $100,000 debt, I would be worse off than a farmer with $200 to their name, wouldn't I?
And
under this survey.
Under this survey...
You would be. So how
hang on,
credible is that?
but whilst your point is made, the proportion of 1.4 million people that are medical students is minuscule.
Well, anyone with debt.
And what we're looking at in that 1.4 million people who, remember, we are talking about assets, then it is actually really about a significant chunk of our population, has very small amount. And that actually has an impact on your well-being, has an impact on your ability to be able to respond to unexpected crises. It is about vulnerability. And that's not okay in our society today, where we've got such a large portion of people. We take our low unemployment rate, was it 4.6%? I mean, that's a significant message to us that of that 1.4 million people, they're working. Majority of them are working, and they're working hard. Many people are doing 2 or 3 jobs in that particular demographic, and yet they're not actually getting the ability to be able to step up in their poverty.
So what is it that you'd like to see change to solve this problem that you've identified here?
Yeah. Well, it's a complex problem. None of your listeners will be thinking this is one single bullet. There's not. But what we are very conscious of is that the government has put on the table a tax working group. Now, tax all around the world is seen as one of the levers that a government can use to try and reduce this type of gap. And other countries have done it. So we've got a tax working group. We're very keen for New Zealand to have a conversation about tax. What is fair tax? What is balanced tax? What is tax that acknowledges the amount of work that you may do, and recognising that a good number of the billionaires don't necessarily work hard. Again, the Oxfam stats has shown that 2/3 of them have either been able to build on their inheritance. They've actually got a monopoly. This is global, as well as the small portion we have here. So it really is about rewarding work. So let's look at tax. That's the thing that New Zealand can do. We've got on our table. The second one that Oxfam's very keen for New Zealand to do is step up to the global stage. Look at how we can work collaboratively with other like-minded governments.
You're looking at multinational tax.
Multinationals and tax secrecy.
All right, that's probably another conversation. But thank you very much for coming in on this one and joining us. We do really appreciate that. Rachel Mesurier, I think I've got that pretty close to right. After years of people butchering my name, I understand. Thank you very much, Rachel, for your time this morning. That's Oxfam New Zealand Executive Director. It's 7:45.
I don't know if this is on your radar today, but if you fancied calling the White House, this is the answer machine message you'll get.
Thank you for calling the White House. Unfortunately,